Hello everyone, and welcome back to our new series on comparative poetry. In this second video, we're going to begin to read and analyze the other poem we'll be comparing, which is Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. And remember, we're going to be comparing it to the first poem that we read, Piano by D.H. Lawrence. So please make sure that you do watch video number 1 in this series before you go ahead and continue with this video. So just a reminder, we need to make sure we're following those steps of comparative poetry. So the first thing that we need to do is fully assess the poet's background. So remember, that's recalling these 3 main questions. So what is their context, both geographically and in terms of time? What do they typically write about? And what happened in their past that made me understand why they choose to write about the topics that they do? So just like we did in the last video, I've gone ahead on the right portion of your screen. I've put a picture of Robert Hayden, and he is an American poet who lived from 1913 till 1980. So I understand geographically he's born and raised in America, specifically in Detroit, Michigan, but also that he grows up during a time period where he would have experienced segregation and discrimination as an African American, but also he would have gone through the civil rights movement. So these things in particular are going to appear in a good portion of his poetry. But then I also need to understand, what does he typically write about? And one of the main things that he writes about is the African American history. So he was well versed in this, and he actually does something very interesting with his poetry. He takes what he understands about African American history as a whole, and he also combines it with his own personal experience. And speaking of which, I also need to think to myself, what happened in their past that might account for how they choose to write and what they choose to write about? And I understand by just doing a little biographical research about Robert Hayden that he grows up in a broken home. So his mother and his father get divorced at an early age, and he's actually raised by foster parents within the same neighborhood where he was born. So he has, in some sense, a really trying childhood, because although he is raised away from his parents very much throughout a good majority of his life struggle to win his affection, so to speak. And for the most part, this involved his father taking care of him and his mother being rather absent, which we're going to see in the poem for today itself. The next thing that I do is I need to read through and annotate the poems that I've been given. So I've already gone through and read and annotated the piano poem. And now I'm going to do the same thing for Those Winter Sundays. So I've included again for you on the right side what that annotation looks like. So again, your poem should be marked up, either physically if you have access to a printer, or electronically. So I'm going to read through once for comprehension and ask myself, do I understand the topic being discussed? And what are certain words that I'm unfamiliar with that I do need to know to understand the poem as a whole? Then I'm going to read through it again for analysis. And now I'm going to ask myself not what is being said, but how it is being said. So what literary devices do I see? How do I see these devices pointing to the broader theme of the poem? And these are all things that I would highlight, underline, circle, and make sure that I write down. Then the last thing we're going to do, and we're going to do this step in our next video, so video number 3 of our comparative poetry series, and that's taking both poems side by side and comparing and contrasting them. So looking at my notes, and again, do I see those similar topics and themes appearing, but also determining what are some significant differences that I see perhaps in the way these topics and themes are communicated, and what sort of broader evaluation can I make on these 2 poems. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into poem number 2, Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold, who polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So the first thing that I do is I read through for comprehension. This is step number 2 in a 3-step process. And I'm going to go ahead and go stanza by stanza and see if I can summarize it just for what is being said. And the first stanza I see rather clearly is saying this, that the speaker's father always wakes up. So it's not just Sundays, but every day, right? Sundays too. He gets up early for the sole purpose of making the house warm for the family, specifically for his son, because that's the only person that's mentioned so far, the speaker himself. And also that no one ever thanks him for this effort of waking up early to do this, particularly because I see that throughout the week he works in hard labor. So we would say that he has a blue-collar job. The next thing that I do is I look at stanza number 2, and I do the same process. So I see that the speaker wakes up to hear the fire going and his father calling him to get ready. And I see this word chronic, and I need to make sure I understand what that means, because it might be a new word to me. And I would look it up and see that it means lasting or occurring for a long time. So this anger that the speaker associates with the house, I'm going to understand that it's not something that just appeared overnight. And by extension, I can clearly understand that the speaker is raised in a troubled home, or at least one that he perceives to be troubled. Then I look to my 3rd stanza and I do the same process. I understand that the speaker doesn't thank his father for all of these efforts. And also I see these 2 words at the very last verse that I need to make sure I understand. The first is austere, and that simply meaning stern or severe, and then offices. And although I might think that, yes, I know what the word office means, we need to be careful because nouns in particular, when we're using them, depending on the context that's being used, has a different meaning. So here, we're not talking about offices in the terms of an office space, like you would go and work in an office building. Here, we're talking specifically about this sense of duty or ceremony that goes along with the things that this father does. And finally, I know that my speaker then looks back and understands how unthankful he was. Let's go ahead then and work on analyzing each stanza individually to see if we can identify the theme that's being discussed here. So the first thing I'm going to do is, again, in my reading for analysis, look for those specific literary devices. Just as we did with the last video, I've gone ahead and in the bubble to the right, I've put the numerical order of the literary devices I'm going to discuss. So the first set I'm going to discuss involves imagery. So here I see an image being painted of every single day, including Sunday, the speaker's father gets up. And it's described in terms of weather as this blue-black cold that the father wakes up to. So this should give you this image of severe cold. It's not just a little chilly, it's frigid. So much so, right, that as he's building this fire, his hands are cracked. And we see that they're cracked because every single day our speaker's father works outside doing heavy labor. So throughout the week, he does enough to get himself exhausted. But then even on the weekends too, he wakes up and he builds this fire. And the speaker says that he makes these banked fires blaze. And I need to understand the image being described here, because once I do, it's really rather beautiful. So when we talk about a fire blazing, we mean that it's very large, perhaps out of control, and it's able to give off great warmth. Turning then to a fire is being banked. If I'm banking a fire, I'm putting coal or ash on top of it, not to kill it or to make it die, but just to make it less alive, less intense. And so the speaker then is saying that the father is able to make these banked fires blaze. So perhaps these fires that have been going on throughout the night to keep people warm, as they've started to die towards the early morning, the father is able to revive them. So this sense that the father is able to revive the warmth in the home, at least from a physical perspective. But even in the midst of all of this hard work, no one ever thanks him. I turn then to the use of both alliteration, but also consonants. And this is important because both of these sound devices in general help to create this upbeat or lilting feel to a poem. And this is interesting because although the way that things sound, weekday weather, banked fires blaze, might make us feel happy, the actual content being discussed is not happy at all, right? The Father is slaving over this fire every single day, in addition to the work he already does, and no one bothers to thank him. And this contrast is going to be interesting in helping to reveal the tone, meaning the attitude of the speaker towards the topic, but also the mood of the poem, meaning how we as the readers feel. And often these two things coincide with one another. So we see a sort of complex tone emerging in the way that the speaker chooses to speak, in a sense, right? This sound device being used to create an upbeat feel, but the content revealing that our speaker feels rather sad, and we should feel sad as well, right? With all the work the Father does that no one bothers to thank him for. I move then to my second stanza, and I begin again to look for first imagery. And I see that the imagery now is shifting away from the Father and towards the Son, who's the speaker, in fact. And that we see the Son wakes up, and he wakes up to rooms that are warm, despite the fact that it's cold outside. So much so that he uses this hyperbole, right, this exaggeration, that he can hear the cold splintering and breaking around him. But we also see that the speaker is reluctant to get up and to get dressed. And we get to understand why perhaps he might be so reluctant with the use of personification. So here he says these chronic angers of that house. And remember, we talked in our comprehension reading of the poem that chronic means long-lasting. And we're combining this with the anger that the speaker attributes to the house itself. Right? So remember, personification is when I give human attributes to non-human things. And here, the house is being described as one that's capable of feeling this long-lasting anger. And I want to draw your attention briefly as well to the diction being used here with house. So you notice throughout the entire poem that the speaker never once uses the word home. And home is a word that carries this connotation, or this understood meaning, of a place that's warm and safe and comforting. So it's important that the speaker chooses actively never to use the word home, but rather house, which simply implies the building they happen to reside in. The next thing I continue to look at is again alliteration and consonants. So we have this continued use of these particular sound devices to create that upbeat feel, splintering, breaking, we're warm. And this is going to continue to stand in contrast to the developing tone and mood of the poem. And this is an important complexity to understand, because as we see it continue throughout the poem, we understand that this complexity in terms of the feel of the poem not meshing with the tone of the poem, representing that broader complex relationship we see develop between the speaker and his Father. Moving then to that final stanza, we continue to look for imagery, and we see again this imagery being focused on the Son and what the Father does for him. So in exchange for driving out this cold, making the home a warm place for him, even so much as polishing his shoes, right? So not just caring about how the Son looks and feels inside the home, but outside the home as well. As we put on our shoes when we're about to leave. The Son turns to him and he speaks with indifference, meaning he doesn't care, which in some sense we could understand as even being the opposite of love. Oftentimes we say that hate is the opposite of love, right? But hate and love are both very strong emotions. They just happen to be on opposite ends of the same spectrum, right? But indifference is this lack of emotion entirely. Then I turn to the repetition being used here. What did I know? What did I know? And this repetition is used so that I fully put my attention and my focus here. And the speaker then turns to himself and he asks this rhetorical question. And you'll understand that we talk about rhetorical questions not because I want an answer, but because either I already know the answer, it's so obvious, how could I not, or I'm trying to emphasize a certain point. And here, when the speaker asks himself, what did I know about love's austere and lonely offices, it's not that he is really contemplating, what did I know? He understands that as a boy, he was not capable mentally or emotionally of fully understanding and grasping the love that his Father had for him, because it didn't look like a normal love relationship might. right? He shows his love through actions that seem rather mundane or ordinary. Then I'm going to turn to metaphor to fully understand that rhetorical question being asked, because it's not that the speaker is literally talking about love's austere and lonely offices. He's talking about the actions of the Father and how these show love. So remember that austere meaning something that's stern or severe, and offices meaning a duty or something that's ceremonious. So here the speaker is rhetorically asking himself, what could I have possibly understood about this stern show of love? That the things that my Father did for me, these duties every morning, he completed by himself. And this is going to end my analysis of the poem and help me come full circle to this tone and mood that's being expressed. One that is at the same time both regretful and perhaps sorrowful. Then I'm going to take my notes and make sure that I understand a few analytical takeaways. And the first is going to be the topic. So the topic is these memories of childhood, something that's shared between this poem and piano. But now instead of a feeling of nostalgia, my poet has this sense of regret or sorrow for the way in which he treated his father as a boy. And maybe perhaps for not being able to understand the complexity of their relationship with one another. And I'm going to use that, my understanding of the topic, as well as the literary devices to derive this theme. And I can think of two in particular. One being this lesson of needing to appreciate the sacrifices that our parents make for us, because they do sacrifice a lot. I'm sure you can think of a multitude of examples off the top of your head of where your parents have sacrificed for you, whether that's in time or money or other things. But also at the same time, this lesson of our relationship with our parents can oftentimes be very complex. So maybe not often idealistic, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can wave this sweeping paintbrush in terms of viewing our relationships with our parents as negative, right? Any human relationship by that extent as well is complex. So needing to approach it with that understanding. And again, making sure I can identify those literary devices that I've used, like alliteration and consonants, imagery, and how all of these things work together to help me better understand my theme. Additional literary devices we found, for example, personification, repetition, and all of these that we've discussed in our analysis. Okay, so before we dive in our next video to comparing these two poems with one another, I want you to answer these 4 questions just to make sure that you fully comprehended this poem by Robert Hayden. So no need to turn these in or submit them unless you would like me to review your answers. This is just simply so that you will be able to assess your understanding of the poem. You can find these questions on page 231 of your literature book, and you can also read them below. So these are the questions that I'm asking. So 1, what time is recalled in this poem, meaning what moment in his life? What does the father do for his son? And how does the child react to his father, the child being the speaker here? Number 2, look back to the list of images in the poem. So all those moments of imagery that we underlined. What image is strongest for you? What stands out the most? Number 3, what is your opinion of the speaker? So do you have a positive or a negative opinion of him? Why might that be? And then number 4, what lesson might be learned from this poem, and explain your answer. So perhaps what other themes were you able to identify as you read? Okay, that will be it for this video. In video number 8, we're going to begin to compare both Piano and Those Winter Sundays, looking at, for example, common topics, common themes, and what sort of perspective does each poet come with in terms of discussing childhood memories. Don't forget to download the worksheet for video number 8. This one's going to be particularly important as it's going to be that baseline model for how we're going to compare the rest of the poems in our series. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.